So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Claire Gillan, who is well known to many of us, having done a PhD here in Cambridge before, a postdoctoral position in New York, and she's now a principal investigator at Trinity College in Dublin. And her work's covered lots of things, including obsessive compulsive disorder, goal-directed action and habits, and the psychological and neural basis of phenomena such as compulsivity. But she also does a lot more than that, including computational psychiatry, looking at transdiagnostic measurements, and both cognitive and biomarker predictions in the general area of mental health disorders, and lots of quite large-scale cognitive neuroscience research as well. So it's fantastic to have you here, Claire, today to talk about a digital revolution for mental health science. Thank you very much, and over to you, Claire.
Great, thanks a million, Rudolph. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you, although I'm very sad I can't be there in person. So I'm going to kick off, I suppose, by explaining myself why I would choose such a, over-the-top title. So why do I think that we need a revolution in mental health science? Well, something that all of you will be aware of course, is that the effect sizes that we have in mental health are often teeny, tiny, very, very small. I can draw on many different examples, but a couple of recent ones that I think you might find interesting. This is a great preprint from American colleagues looking at reanalysis of data from the Human Connectome Project and the ABCD study. And what they show, or what they found, is that the largest correlation they observed between the structure of the brain and any aspect of psychopathology measured was a correlation of 0.16. And so what this graph shows you here is basically, for that largest correlation, how many subjects you need to be able to reliably estimate that effect. And you can think about, of course, where we really sit in terms of most studies that are done is over here. And you're very likely with samples of this size to find things that are basically wrong in the opposite direction. And because of issues with publication bias or assistance for publication, often the wronger you are, the more likely you are to get published. And this is, of course, a problem. We don't just have to, criticize brain behavior relationships. So this is structural, and the same thing was true of resting state functional connectivity. But we can also look at things like adverse childhood events, which is a wealth of data showing increase one's risk for mental health problems or indeed physical health problems. So this is showing that the more adverse childhood experiences you have, the higher your risk for mental health and physical health. But what's important is what we can do with that information. So in the study that came out in JAMA this year, JAMA Psychiatry, showed that the area under the curve, our ability to actually predict someone's future risk based on how they score in terms of the number of adverse childhood experiences they've had is really low. So it's not very much better than chance. And it's at the point, as they argue in this paper, where it's not really clinically actionable. So this is true throughout mental health, and is true also of cognition, though again, we have been stuck for some time, I think, in these really small samples. So one of the solutions to this problem, in my view, is that we need much larger samples, because we need to be able to capture effects that are small. It doesn't mean that they're not important because they're small, but it means that if we're going to estimate them reliably and put them together with other sources of information, we need to be able to estimate them. And when I talk about putting it together with other pieces of information, what I'm talking about are capturing what we know are complex interactions that exist between our environmental predispositions, genetic, biological risk factors, and state factors, right? How stressed you are at a current moment in time, and so on and so forth. And so it's really important, and fits kind of under this umbrella of we reach larger ends, is that really what we want to do are make predictions about unseen data. And that's where clinical value comes in to our basic, very interesting foundational scientific findings. A second thing that I kind of want to harp on a little bit about today is that we over-rely on cross-sectional designs in mental health research. And I think there's a major gap in terms of longitudinal data. And I don't necessarily mean, gathering data today and then following people up in 10 years. Of course, that's a great study design. I'm talking about even at a basic level of looking at temporal dependencies and fluctuations in symptoms over time. Looking, for example, if someone gets better following treatment, what aspects of cognition change, perhaps change before that occurs, as a way of understanding mediators of treatment response, and put another way, understanding why a treatment works. And again, what follows under this necessarily is our ability not just to make predictions about unseen data, but predictions about the future, right? And that's again where the clinical value comes in. And so what I'm going to try and argue today, or get across today, I'm not arguing with anybody, is that digital forms of data collection, I think, can get us there, and they can get us there relatively quickly. So I'm going to have 4 parts to the talk today. The first is, so it's going to be a mix of some data that's been published and some unpublished data and preprints. So this first part is just kind of a basic housekeeping to make you all come on my side about the idea that we can ditch the diagnosis in mental health research. And that's, you know, sometimes a contentious issue for some. I think it's becoming a bit less so. And I'm going to show some empirical data that suggests that we can rely on self-report assessments in lieu of diagnoses, and in many cases, the results actually, or the effect is that our measurements are actually more reliable. And then I'm going to talk about some newer stuff about scaling up our research. Once you agree that we can ditch this diagnosis, we can do it through gamification and smartphones, in particular an app that my lab has developed. I'm going to talk about a pet project of ours that I'm very excited about, which is our efforts to take treatment prediction research online as a way of scaling up our sample sizes. And we've really just gotten this to work recently, so I'm very excited to show you some preliminary data. And then finally, I'm going to talk about something totally separate, but I think also very interesting in the context of this digital revolution, which is the notion of using social media data instead of experience sampling. Okay, so without further ado, I want to start to talk by saying, asking the question, what's better, dimensions or diagnoses, in terms of how we understand what it is to have a mental health condition. And I think this statement here has become much less contentious, or maybe not at all, which is the idea that DSM diagnoses are an imperfect ground truth for research. So let's take clinical practice out of the equation for a minute, and let's just talk about research. So we know that patients are heterogeneous within disorder, right? That means that they can have very different presentations and get assigned the same diagnostic label. We also know that patients are highly similar across disorders. These disorders are comorbid with one another, and you can look more similar to someone who has a different diagnosis to you than someone within that category. And then people, who are more interested in looking at the psychometrics and methodologies around this, there's quite a lot of research now looking at the evidence for taxa versus these dimensional perspectives in mental health. And the evidence for most disorders is incredibly weak for any evidence for there being a categorical distinction. There's exceptions where there's maybe a low level of evidence in some conditions like, or low to moderate, like schizophrenia, autism. But for most of the disorders that we're talking about in mental health science, most of the most prevalent ones, there's really no evidence for taxa whatsoever. So in terms of the data that we have to support this, going beyond the symptoms and looking at the cognition, as many of you will be familiar with from a lot of studies that have looked at this in different ways, we know, of course, that cognitive deficits don't follow these diagnostic boundaries. So in my PhD, as Rudolph mentioned, I did a lot of work with Trevor looking at goal-directed learning, so how people make prospective plans and use that to make choices. We show that ability makes people vulnerable to getting stuck in habits, and that this goal-directed capacity is diminished in people with obsessive compulsive disorder. But of course, we've seen when we look across different diagnostic groups like Valerie Voon did, or within the general population, that there's really quite a spread across all the many, many different aspects of mental health in terms of the association that you see with this cognitive measurement, deficits in goal-directed learning. So yes, so these are self-report assessments, and this is showing the degree of association. So yes, OCD symptom severity is associated with deficits in goal-directed planning, but so too are individual differences in eating disorders, impulsivity, alcohol addiction, and you see this gradation across the scores. So in this particular study, which was actually our first foray online using Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and you see we got a nice large sample for this, we were able to identify a dimension that cut through these aspects of mental health that explained deficits in goal-directed control a bit better than using these disorder-based clinical questionnaires, self-report. And so what you see here is that compulsiveness is associated quite relatively specifically with these deficits in goal-directed control. Now, what's missing from this study, as many clinicians might correctly assert, is that these aren't patients, right? These are general public that we've measured online, and we're not actually comparing this to a diagnosis that's been assigned using a standardized clinical tool. So is there evidence that this kind of self-report data, and indeed this transdiagnostic framework, is actually superior to using a categorical one when you assign diagnoses? I'm going to talk about this study that we had published last year in JAMA Psychiatry, which was again, like as we start to build through this talk, I'm going to talk about how we're trying to, with each study, elaborate on the kind of things that we can do in these online methods. So this is a fully internet-based patient study, as distinct from the last. So I did this while I was at New York University, and what we did was we recruited people from all over the United States. And after they signed up and met some basic eligibility criteria, we telephoned them and did a full clinical structured interview. And so what we get then in doing so are patients who have multiple disorders at once, which of course is the standard, right? It's not the exception in mental health. So you might have one patient who has generalized anxiety, social anxiety, and PTSD, another with OCD and trichotillomania, a patient with 5 concurrent diagnoses. So we met and included all of these participants who signed up. And indeed, what we found was that the mean number of diagnoses in the sample was 3.7, and there was a range from 1 to 9 concurrent diagnoses of the 19 that we assessed in everybody who participated in this study. So again, as you all know, these disorders are highly comorbid, and this is what happens when you recruit people in the real world who suffer from these conditions. So once we had people recruited and eligible after their phone interview, we had them complete cognitive assessments through their computer from the comfort of their homes. And the final sample we had in this study was 285 patients who either had a diagnosis of OCD, generalized anxiety, or a combination of the two. And the relatively simple question we wanted to ask was, would our cognitive measures distinguish patients who had a compulsive disorder to those who had a control disorder, which is generalized anxiety that we know co-occurs commonly with obsessive compulsive disorder? Or if you take a more dimensional framework, we might argue instead that really the differences between these people who get assigned these different diagnostic labels are not so great. And actually what we're seeing is evidence for dimensions that cut through these disorders, and that one of these dimensions, the compulsive one, which we've studied previously, might do a better job at tracking these cognitive deficits. So, so what tracks cognition better? These dimensions or diagnoses is the central question of this paper, and we're using a task that measures model-based planning, which is the same as in the last study I showed you. So just very quickly, I'm going to show you the mean level performance of model-based planning or goal-directed learning on this task across individuals who had these 3 diagnoses. And basically, you don't have to squint too hard. There's no differences between these 3 groups in their performance at this goal-directed learning task. But within these individuals, we had all of them provide us with self-report information at the same time as they did the cognitive testing. So we could say, let's forget about the diagnosis that we've given them through this clinical interview, and instead look at individual differences in compulsiveness through the whole sample. And when we do that, and this is the same thing we're plotting on the y-axis here, performance, the goal-directed learning task, what you see is that performance goes down as compulsiveness increases in this sample. So it's a replication of what we've seen in the prior data set, but this time in a group of patients diagnosed with either OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, or a combination. And just, I encourage you to take a look at this paper, and even just taking a look at this graph and really just looking at where people sit based on diagnoses on this compulsive dimension. And what you'll see is that there are people who don't have a diagnosis of OCD who still score high in compulsiveness. And also importantly, people who have a diagnosis of OCD, but are not very compulsive whatsoever. And this is really important, I think, for us moving forward and looking at really what goes on under the hood of these diagnoses, and maybe these dimensions can capture variance a bit better. The last slide I want to show you on this before I go on to some new data so another purpose of this study was to look at, so in the eLife paper that I presented before, we had this complex of intrusive thoughts and compulsiveness that tended to fall together. In this study, we designed it so we could actually split those 2 things apart. And we found that the relationships with deficits in goal-directed learning were specific to this compulsive dimension. We also had a general distress factor in the study that we measured. And as you'll see here, there was also a negative association with, so this is a complex of impairment, anxiety, distress. But this goes away when you control for compulsiveness. We replicate these effects at follow-up. So we were able to get 110 people just over a year later to complete the assessments again, and we see the same thing. And then the last thing I want to show you here is, just to kind of broaden the scope of it a bit more, is that, these findings, we're talking about goal-directed learning or model-based planning, but when we think about the broader umbrella of executive control, we really see the same kind of patterns across the study. So we also measured cognitive flexibility on the Wisconsin card sorting test, and also a measure of abstract reasoning. a form of Raven's matrices or something kind of based on that. And we see again this really this quite specific association with compulsiveness and not general distress or obsessionality that again replicates at follow-up in this sample. Okay, so at this point, so hopefully I've convinced you that there's certainly some value to looking at these dimensions and that it's important to make distinctions between them under the hood of these diagnostic labels. But I think, as many of you will notice, from particularly the scatter plot I just showed you on the last slide, these effects are real, but of course, they're still very small. So what can we actually do with these insights to have practical value? So the next thing I want to talk about is our efforts to really take another step change in our ability to gather large amounts of data and put them together on this for the same individual. And that's we try to achieve this by developing a smartphone app called Neureka. So I'm going to take a step through one of the games that we have in our app, because I think it's nice to connect the dots to this kind of silly game that we have in the app and how we can get a measure that's, we think, meaningful for cognition and maybe useful for mental health prediction in the future. So we created this game in the app, it's called Cannon Blast. And basically your goal in this, hopefully the video will work, is to collect these diamonds. So you're shooting out of one of these two chambers on the right and left, and then you gather them as you go forward. As you do this task, you fire from one of these two chambers, and this is the thing that we're really interested in, and your decision of which side to fire from. And one side is mostly purple, as you'll see, and one side is mostly pink. And another feature of this task is there's a finite number of balls, so you don't really want to be wasting them as you go forward. That becomes important because we have this very irritating feature of the app that our software developer fought tooth and nail to keep out, which is that on a certain proportion of trials, the balls they explode before it has a chance to hit the diamond, just like it did there. That's a very frustrating thing for users, but we tell them at the beginning that there's ways that they can avoid this from happening based on the choices that they make. Basically that sometimes the pink balls are mostly these duds and other times it's the purples. So basically I can kind of give an illustrative example. Let me see if that takes back to the start. So if you have an event like this, let's say, so in that example, I'll just stop it here. So in this example, you shot from this pink side and you got a purple ball and it exploded. So the core premise of this task is your temptation on that trial is to switch over to the other side following that ball exploding. So I pressed on this side, the ball came out and exploded. I'm going to move over to the other side because that action didn't lead to a rewarding outcome. And that's a model-free form of decision-making. But what you should actually do, what a model-based planner should do on this task, is actually not switch on this trial and continue and press on this side again. That's because the purple ball was not expected to come out from this side. So that piece of information that the purple ball exploded actually tells you something about, you should make the inference, right, that you're better off choosing this side because it's more likely to give you a pink ball, which is currently doing well. So it's a bit absurd, but it's a premise behind this kind of a task is that we can get people to play because they like shooting these diamonds. They have intrinsic motivation for it. And then we can get better longitudinal data, or at least more longitudinal data from people through time. And this is just a graph that I'm not going to spend too long on. People are familiar with it from the classic task, which is based on Nathaniel Dawes, a former supervisor of mine. But we see we get the same pattern of behavior that you get in a standard task, which is that people are more likely to repeat choices when the ball doesn't explode to when it does. So this main effect of good ball versus bad ball, but that depends on how expected that ball was to come out of this particular side of the chamber. And we can measure on an individual subject basis what the strength of this interaction is, which is what we've been doing in the past two studies I showed you, and relate that to aspects of mental health. So this is showing, very preliminary data from the app. We have just over 1,000 people who've completed these different self-report assessments and played the game with enough trials for us to estimate model-based planning. And you see the same kind of thing I showed before, where you get negative associations with these aspects of mental health and model-based planning. This is kind of a silly illustration, but I want to make it nonetheless. Of course, these effects change dramatically when you control for other pieces of information we have on subjects. And this is a very rich database that we're gathering on every participant in this study who willingly provides this information. So for example, if we control for education, the effects go way down. The effects go up when we control for age, which has negative associations with mental health, and so on and so forth. Another thing I suppose to show you in this data set is that we can use the same transdiagnostic structure we saw before, and although the data again are preliminary, we're seeing the same kind of patterns that we expect from the in-person samples, that the associations are really best captured by this compulsive dimension. And all from a game on your phone where you can, where you're essentially shooting diamonds while you're sitting on the bus, or as we imagine most people play. So as I said, it's very preliminary. I want to just describe some of the core things that we're doing with this app right now. So one thing I think that's very important and missing from this kind of research is the active optimization of these tasks so that we can measure the mental health phenomena accurately, and so that we can have predictions that are meaningful. So we're engaged in this in various ways. There's lots of features and controls we've built into the task, such as, difficulty. We have trials where the diamond is moving around on the screen and distracting subjects, various other conditions that allow us to assess in a really data-driven way how we can get the best fit to compulsive behavior. So what I showed you on the last slide is not that, that's the standard measure. We imagine we can do better. You can think of it as a form of p-hacking, and then we apply it on new data, this process of optimization. But the real, gold mine, as I see it from this kind of data set, is developing multivariate risk models. So what I showed you a moment ago is basically a sanity check. But what we can do is really develop much more complex understanding of various factors that contribute to people's risk for specific aspects of mental health, using methods like machine learning, which we're able to use, fortunately, given the kind of size of the data sets that we're gathering. I hinted at the beginning of an interest, and I'm going to expand on that in a moment, on within subject longitudinal assessment. So this is another new feature that we've put out in the app. Actually, it just came out yesterday, where we're not only conducting experience sampling within individuals, we're actually letting them, see a graph of their data through time. So they're using the app to monitor their own mood in ways that they may find helpful for their own mental health, maintenance, care, reflection. But we get to use that data again to try and understand how different aspects of mental health relate to one another. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the final section on our network approaches. Another feature that we're putting out in the app next month is called Compulsive Me, although I'm not sure the name will stick because some of the users don't necessarily love it. But basically what this allows us to do is do experience sampling for compulsiveness. So we can measure things that are clinically relevant, like people checking windows, locks, and doors, binge eating behavior, and more, as well as behaviors that we see in the general population, like excessive checking of your phone and emails and whatnot. So we're able to study these things over time, understand how they exist in a network, and compare different forms of compulsions to one another in these kind of dynamics. The final point I want to make on this section is that another, one of the aims of this project is not just to enrich the kind of data sets that we have, but to share this with the community. So I do encourage you to get in touch with me if you want to use this for your own research. It's completely free. And so if you want to sample compulsiveness through time using our app, get in touch. And the idea here is that we can build data sets that the whole community can avail of and are a bit stronger together if we work together on this. Okay, so I'm going to talk next about something that's, I guess, a little further along, but still not quite complete, which is our efforts to take treatment prediction research online. And this is a project that we've been working on since 2018. It's called the Precision in Psychiatry Study, and the goal is really to move beyond these cross-sectional designs into studies that have the more short-term potential for having real-world clinical impact. So this is a fully internet-based 4-week treatment prediction study where we have a goal of gathering data from 1,000 people who go through a course of internet-based cognitive behavioral therapy. We do this with our partner, Silvercloud Health, who many of you who are doctors may know. They partner with the NHS talking therapies. And so we particularly collaborate with Berkshire NHS on this. So everybody who gets prescribed a course of CBT through Silvercloud gets an invitation to our study at that time. We recruit them and verify their participation, how much they're engaged in the program, etc., through the platform, and follow them really through time. We also have, or are aiming to have 200 individuals who started a course of antidepressant treatment and are subject to all the same kind of assessments. In this, it's the procedure is a little less controlled, right? We don't know how much time they spent on a platform. We don't, measure their blood, how much, whether they're taking their medication and so forth. But what we do have them do is upload a photo of their prescription at the start of the study, and then we follow them throughout, and we tell them they'll still be paid even if they stop taking their medication. And we're really interested in what makes people stop medication, as well as who completes it. So we have these methods to do some kind of verification in that sense. But two very different arms of individuals going through the same kind of procedures. The goal is to develop a tool that will predict who's going to respond to treatment using a combination of variables that we gather at baseline. And a secondary one, because we have pre and post assessments in all these individuals, is to try and understand how treatment works. And I'll talk a little bit about this, and I'll show you some data. But before I do that, so this is work by Sharon Lee in my lab. I'm just going to show you kind of some proof of principle for this study. So these are the data as at about a month ago. So we had 215 CBT completers and 90 SSRI. We now have over 300 CBT completers. And basically, so at this current trajectory, we should have our sample of 1,000 by early next year. So this is, I suppose, the first thing I want to get across is that this kind of approach produces results that we would expect, and we can detect change after just 4 weeks. We realize 4 weeks is a relatively short duration for a treatment prediction study. These are changes in depression from CBT and SSRI. And we can also look at the transdiagnostic changes that we see across the sample. So these are the effect sizes we see for various aspects of mental health that are measured. So overall, the biggest improvements are seen for depression and anxiety, but we also see improvements in obsessive compulsive disorder, symptoms, apathy, social anxiety, and everything except things like impulsivity, which we expect to be a bit more static and not affected by SSRI or CBT treatment, at least CBT treatment for depression and anxiety. But what's important, the kind of principle behind this study is that these graphs are very misleading, right? And there's loads and loads of variation underneath them. So this is a study, again, at the snapshot in time with 215 CBT subjects showing that variation in who responds. And yes, some people get better and they get profoundly better after 4 weeks. Some people stay the same and some people get quite a lot worse. So what we're trying to do in this study is understand those differences and predict them. So we're waiting, of course, to have our full sample before we engage in the treatment prediction research, but at about the halfway mark is where we're stopping with respect to looking at changes following treatment in individuals. And one thing we're interested in particular is how negative biases change in individuals as a result of treatment with either CBT or SSRI. And so, as we know, CBT in particular is designed around many of these cognitive and learning theories from psychology, but we actually know relatively little about the specifics of what changes in the brain following treatment. The vast majority of studies have been done using self-report assessments pre and post. There's virtually nothing looking at cognitive changes, and in particular cognitive changes like hot cognition of the sort I'm going to talk about, or that is talked a lot about in the context of treatment for anxiety and depression. So in this study, we wanted to look at a biomarker we've been working on cross-sectionally for a little while now, which is metacognition, or how people reflect on their own abilities. And so we do this using a task that was developed by Steve Fleming, and it's a relatively simple task, quite repetitive. So you're presented on each trial with two stimuli like this, and your task is to say which side has more dots. And we titrate it so that it's at about 70% difficulty for everybody. So everyone does about as well at the main task as one another. But we ask them on each trial to rate their confidence in their performance. So to what extent do they think they got it correct on each trial? And from this, we can get two important measurements. So one is metacognitive sensitivity, and that's essentially a measure of how right I am about whether I was right. So if we look at confidence on the x-axis here, and we look at trials when I was correct, and I picked the right side, the side that had the more dots, versus incorrect, what we're interested in seeing is how overlapping is my confidence distribution on those two trial types. So someone who's got a good concept, who's able to reflect accurately on their own performance, might look like this and have a lack of overlap of their distributions, whereas someone who's not very metacognitively cognitively sensitive and would have overlapping distributions, which means that their confidence doesn't change actually all that much depending on whether they were actually right or wrong in that trial. Now, another thing we can measure in this task that's relates in particular to this kind of these negative self-focused cognitions is what we call metacognitive bias. And this is independent of how accurate your assessments are. Do you have this mean level shift overall in terms of your confidence? Do you tend to be overconfident or underconfident relative to the entire sample and irrespective of your actual performance on the task? So as I said, we've been interested in this model for a while, and we've looked at it previously cross-sectionally in the general population, and we see these really interesting bidirectional associations with the dimensions I introduced earlier. So people who are high in compulsive behavior and intrusive thought tend to be overconfident in their decision-making, and people who are high in anxious depression tend to be underconfident. And we actually see trends for the converse relationship when we look at accuracy. So people with depression think they're always doing worse, but they're actually more accurate at judging their performance. And we see the opposite pattern for people high in compulsiveness. And this has been replicated using a similar design since then. So what we're interested in the context of this study is looking at metacognitive abilities pre and post treatment in our sample and trying to understand if the active ingredient in this treatment has an effect on people's metacognitive processes. So another way of putting that is, does people's success at treatment actually relate to changes in these objective tests of self-evaluation in this task? So can we measure that objectively using a game? And this is the same task I just described, but instead of plain dots, we put a sunflower around them and you're counting seeds. And then the kind of final question we want to ask, because we have this smaller control sample of people taking SSRIs, is do these treatments work differently? There's actually plenty of evidence to suggest that they may not, in terms of, so obviously they have different modes of efficacy, they act in different ways, but in both cases you see changes in positive and negative biases following both SSRI and CBT treatment. But as I said, most of the evidence, a lot of the evidence for this, particularly with SSRIs, comes from healthy subjects who have been given an antidepressant and followed for a number of weeks. So in the context of this clinical study, we wanted to see, do people, why do some people get better and others don't? So first of all, I'm going to show you the changes that we see in confidence bias. I'm just going to focus on confidence bias today, pre and post. And so what we see overall is that people are more confident at the end of the 4 weeks of treatment in our CBT arm than not. Of course, this could just be a practice effect. So when we don't have any placebo control arm in this approach we're using to treatment prediction research. What's important is that we see that this change in metacognition scales with clinical improvement. So the people who have the largest changes in confidence are those who have the biggest reduction in scores on the QIDS assessment of depression. When we compare this to the smaller SSRI arm, we're seeing the same pattern of results. So people increase their confidence from pre to post, and this trends, at least for now, with scaling with those changes that we get in treatment. The final thing I want to show you on this, and there's lots we're planning to do with this. So as I said, this is data from 215. Our stopping point is 500 for this and 100 for this arm. We'll have a lot of information that we haven't looked at yet or haven't gotten access to yet, which is what kind of treatment people undertook with the Silver Cloud platform, which we expect will be quite informative in terms of understanding which CBT protocols and modules are really affecting confidence biases most. The final bit of data I want to show you from this study is that these effects are specific to metacognition. This is a study done by Celine Fox as I said, Celine was working on the last data set as well. So in the same study, we measured model-based planning, pre and post. And just like confidence, we see this general increase that could just be seen as a practice effect. So people get modestly better from pre to post in their model-based planning. But in contrast to metacognition, we don't see any changes at all that's in terms of scaling with treatment success in depression. And this is what we expect, not least because model-based planning deficits are not characteristic of depression, but also we've observed in clinical studies with OCD that are much more focused on OCD, that these executive goal-directed deficits don't seem to be targeted by exposure and response prevention style treatments for obsessive compulsive disorder. And then again, just to kind of like round out, I suppose, this like plug for this general kind of approach, this study I'm describing here had 17 patients with OCD going through cognitive behavioral therapy, and it took us 2 years to gather that data. We gather that amount of data every 2 weeks using this new methodology. Okay, so then the next steps, and I suppose the real goal of this study, or the bigger purpose, is something that Sharon is working on, which is trying to use these data to make predictions about who's going to respond. So not looking at changes in cognition pre-post, but using a very rich data set that we get, over 600 baseline data points per person, to develop models that can predict who ultimately responded to treatment. We have 3 different cognitive tests, which give rise to, about a dozen different measures from them. But importantly, we also measure psychological, lifestyle, medical, clinical, environmental factors, past and present, people's expectations about treatment, anything you can imagine or has been suggested as having an impact on people's ultimate outcome. Clinically, we're measuring this study, and we're going to put together using machine learning methods when we reach our target N of 1,000 at the start of next year. Okay. So I'm just going to go on to the last section of the talk, and I suppose I like to say at this point, if you answered an email and got completely distracted and are just coming back, you can start here effectively, because this is I suppose a departure from some of the stuff I've talked about before, and it's like a little mini talk, you could start again if you had a little lapse. So in this last talk, I'm shifting gear to, it falls under the general umbrella of trying to reimagine the kind of nosology that we use in mental health. And one prominent alternative framework is a network framework. So when we think about a classic DSM-based framework for major depression, the view is that there's this latent thing called major depression, and it causes the symptoms that people experience and that we measure typically in these instruments. So network theory takes a very different approach, and it says instead that these mental health disorders are actually caused by the interactions that exist between these quote unquote symptoms. And instead of symptoms, we're really talking about, psychological, emotional, physiological states of being that humans experience and that we know fluctuate through time within ourselves. This network, so there's lots of evidence, lines of evidence for this kind of framework. And, at a very basic level, we know that certain nodes in these networks do cause one another, in studies that have looked in a limited sense at like the impact of fluctuations in sleep on your mood and so on, and on your concentration and so on and so forth. One of the, I suppose, most interesting predictions I think that this theory makes surrounds the phenomenon that we know that external stressors can cause people to kind of tip over into a state of mental illness. So the idea in this framework is that because all of these experiences, let's call them psychological states, have causal relations to one another, when you have an external stressor that impacts 1 or 2 nodes in the system, it can then propagate throughout the system and actually cause you to get stuck in one of these states of mental illness. So in this kind of crude diagram, you might have a stressor that affects your sleep, and you can see it cascading throughout the network and causing all these knock-on effects and positive feedback loops that could be construed as the departure into a state of mental illness proper that then needs treatment. I suppose a nice intuitive prediction of this model that builds from this is the idea that people who have less tightly connected networks are more resilient than those who have a lot of causal relations between different symptoms. The problem, now there's been a lot of research looking at this, but the main problem is that almost all of the studies that have been done in this area define these networks cross-sectionally. And to define these networks, there's nothing magic about them. We're looking at the correlation between these different symptoms. In a cross-sectional network, you're looking at the extent to which people who have poor sleep also have poor mood, and so on and so forth, and constructing a network based on those partial correlations. But all the way I describe this network and all the core principles of it are actually at the level of the individual, not at the level of the group. So just to kind of like drum home this point, I think is a nice intuitive example that, of course, not all cross-sectional relationships correspond to the inter-individual relationships that we also see. So if we take people's typing speed, for example, we see that people who type a lot of words per minute tend to make few errors, but people who type very slowly are also those who tend to make more errors. But of course, when you look under the hood within each individual in those same measures, you know, even if you're down here, you're an expert typer, the faster you go, the more errors you'll make relative to yourself. So you can see how you can get these completely opposing relationships depending on whether you're looking at a network cross-sectionally or inter-individually. So it's very clear to people that we really need to be looking at these networks in an intra-individual level. So looking at how a person's sleep affects their mood the next day or at the same moment in time, how they correlate. But the problem is that these kind of data are just incredibly difficult to come by. There's this, you know, somewhat famous example of this person who followed themselves through EMA for a year, and it spanned the transition into a depressed episode. They did find some preliminary support for some of these predictions of network theory, but it's all descriptive because, of course, this is an N of 1. So something we decided, you know, we try and tackle in the lab is this issue of how we can acquire the kind of data that are needed to really study causal relationships between these different psychological states and within an individual, and then with the view to using these then to make predictions if someone's really at a tipping point, if they're about to get sick at some point in the near future. So Sean Kelly, a student in my lab, had the bright idea that people have been archiving their thoughts and feelings for many years on social media platforms like Twitter, and we can actually use the content of their tweets to make inferences about their mood. And so just to give you the requisite, you know, Donald Trump example, so someone at this website, for example, scraped the tweets of Trump in the year, I think, preceding his election, after noticing that anytime that Trump said it came from an Android phone, the kind of words that were used were much more, let's say, hyperbolic, derogatory, etc., versus any time the same account tweeted from an iPhone. And they were able then to scrape all the content of these tweets and take that observation and formalize it and find, for example, the probability that a given tweet was from actually Donald Trump himself or his campaign, you know, depended on the presence of certain words. So it was much more likely to be from his phone if the words crazy, weak, joke, dumb, or guns were used. It was much more likely to be Trump than any of these kind of like hashtags, dates, times, kind of more dispassionate tweets, let's say. So building on this kind of general observation that, of course, there's meaningful information to be scraped from what people say on Twitter or type. And so what we did is a similar kind of approach in that we scrape the Twitter accounts of consenting users, process them down into something a little more manageable than individual words. So we use a pre-existing library that can translate these into 90 grammatical or emotional categories of language, and look at how those different aspects relate to depression, may exist in a network, and fluctuate through time as people transition into episodes of illness. So in this study, which is up as a preprint, if you want to look at it, we consented over 900 Twitter users. We got their permission to process their tweets, and then we also got them to complete a standardized depression instrument and self-report the dates in the last year when they had a depressed episode. People have already looked at correlations between the way people use language and their mental health status. So we were able to draw on 9 a priori text features that prior research has linked to differences in present depressive symptomatology. And I'm just going to plot these here just kind of as a sanity check. So without getting too lost in the data, I'll just give you a couple of examples. So we found associations with all of these a priori features of text. If you look over here, for example, people who are higher in depression tend to use I pronouns more. They use we less, they use more swear words, and less positive emotion and more negative emotion in the content of their tweets. So what this says is that, yes, we can replicate those classic findings. We want to take this a bit further and try and test some of the core principles of network theory. So what we do with this data is we have this time series for everybody over the past year, and we can form a personalized network for each person in that study, saying, you know, on times when you were talking about yourself, were you also more likely to be using negative words, for example? So this is just like a fairly meaningless network from the whole sample at large, who could be anywhere in the depression symptomatology scale. But as I said, we have a specific network for each individual subject in our study. And so what we can do with that is look at, again, testing some of these core principles of network theory. One is that the more tightly connected your network is, so the stronger the links between these nodes, the greater your depression severity. And we found that that was the case in this study. And then lastly, I suppose more interestingly, really leveraging the temporal dynamics that we had, As I mentioned before, we had people tell us dates, periods of time when they were depressed in the last year. So we wanted to look within subject if these network features change when someone's in an acute episode versus not. And so looking here at network strength for the 286 people who reported a depressive episode in the last year in our study, we found that this was the case, that individuals had a more tightly connected network when they were within an episode versus outside. And this connectivity between all these nodes in the network was fairly consistent across all of the nodes that we studied. So they all had tighter connections in general to one another, specifically to one another when people were acutely ill. Okay, so I'm gonna aim to stop here. There's lots more I can say and hopefully it might come out in the questions. But to summarize, in terms of this personalized networks, we found that these networks are more connected in people with depression. We're not looking cross-sectionally here. We have a network per participant based on the thoughts and feelings that they've archived on Twitter. We found that the connectivity of those networks increases when someone gets sick. In terms of the applications of this, we're really interested in understanding, using these personalized networks, if we can figure out which specific psychological, physiological states will be more impactful for us to intervene on for an individual. So if guilt is the primary node in this person's network, is this the one that the clinician should address, even though it's at the same mean level as other symptoms? It's this connectivity that we think is really what's causing the problems for this person. And similarly, can we use this kind of network to identify people who are at risk before they get ill? So I'll skip over this, but as I said, we're measuring this more directly using our smartphone app right now, so you can watch this space. So just to sum up, like these effect sizes are very small. As I tried to introduce, mental health and illness is incredibly complex human experience. So we don't experience disorders in isolation, we experience cascades. We know that they are associated with a wide range of environmental factors, biological factors, and so on and so forth. There's, literally thousands of correlates of these mental health disorders. So what we're trying to do in our lab is not to try and get the purest samples possible, but to really just lean into this complexity and try and measure it and harness it to make the best to make predictions that are clinically actionable. It's my view that we fundamentally need much larger data sets to do this, and that the kind of methods I've talked about today are one way that we can get there outside of other, excellent methods like large-scale consortia, etc. And so hence, all of these things together, the need, I think, for a digital revolution in the kind of methods that we use, so we can achieve these aims more widely, and we can really shift our focus. And any lab can do these kind of studies with these kind of methods. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to that. Hopefully it wasn't too fast. And I just want to thank my lab who are grinding through all of these really interesting projects, and the collaborators on the kind of work that I focused on today in particular. So thank you.
Claire, thank you very much indeed, and a virtual round of applause, I think, to begin with. So thank you, that's terrific.